guys, it's Q. Thanks for joining us here at the Thoughts for Living podcast, where information is thoughtful and engaging. Here's this week's episode.
Hello, and welcome again to Thoughts for Living. We're so glad that you could join us today in this second episode that we're engaged in. In our previous episode, we had begun reading from the work of noted theologian Dr. James H. Cone. And we were reading his important work entitled A Black Theology of Liberation. And we were reading from the 20th anniversary edition. Dr. Cone is considered by many the father of Black theology, the father of Black liberation theology. He had written many books, but many would say the first two books he wrote, the first being in 1969, Black Theology and Black Power, and then his next book, which was written in 1970, that we're reading from today, A Black Theology of Liberation, were seminal. Prior to Dr. Cone's writing, there did not exist a such thing as Black theology or Black liberation theology. Up until that time, in 1969, the predominant ideas about theology were the ideas that were held by white theologians. And Cone and others had come to the understanding that basically white theologians' interpretation of Scripture really just helped to maintain Black people's oppression. And if Black people were to have a different way of interpreting and viewing Scripture, those scholars would have to develop it themselves. The oppressor is not going to let you go free. If Black theologians were to free themselves, or were to be free, I should say, they were going to have to free themselves. And Cone took the lead to develop a way of interpreting Scripture that centered Black people and Black people's lives. And in general, his main thrust was that if you looked at Scripture, and I am a Christian, I'm trying to do my best to follow Christ. If you look at the Scriptures, Old and New Testament, what you see generally is God in the Old Testament identifying with the oppressed people, right? Most of us are familiar with the story, right? Supposedly, these people who were Hebrews come into the land of Egypt, and after coming there, led by their patriarchs, suffice it to say that they were supposedly made to, in the story, they were made to, they were enslaved, and God appears to Moses in a burning bush, and he sends Moses to tell Pharaoh to do what? Let my people go. He didn't send Moses to tell Pharaoh to keep my people in bondage. God identified with the people who were being oppressed, the enslaved. And likewise, we see in the New Testament when Christ comes out of the wilderness, goes into the temple, Luke 4, and proclaims, after reading from Isaiah, that God has come to set captives free, to liberate the oppressed. And he says, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And so Cone takes this perspective and suggests that if God is identifying with the oppressed, well, in 1969, if you look around, who were the oppressed? The oppressed were black people. We were fighting for our dignity. Black people in Montgomery, Alabama, had begun in 1955 the civil rights movement. That movement had ignited other movements in the United States of oppressed peoples and indigenous peoples, BIPOC. But Cone just couldn't, he couldn't come to grips with what white preachers was teaching and preaching and the way white congregants were acting. Right? They were loving their neighbor if he was white. They were loving God if he was white. In other words, they saw other white people as human beings and could treat them in some sense as Christian. But those same Christians could not treat black people as human beings, as fellow Christians, as brothers and sisters. And I dare say, my friends, this is still the case in the United States today. Yes, we've had some, some people would say successes. There's some integration going on, right? Some, but public schools are more segregated today than they were in the 1960s. We have gentrification. Matter of fact, the system has gone back more and tried to take away the few rights that black and brown people have fought for in this country. And I don't want to disparage anybody, but simply because we can marry white men and marry white women hasn't changed the reality of this society. This is still a white racist society. But the good news is God is still identified with the oppressed. God in in her infinite wisdom, the Spirit, has decided to side with the oppressed. And so we want to continue reading just a bit more from Cone's book, A Black Theology of Liberation. It is to be expected that some will ask, why black theology? Is it not true that God is colorblind? Is it not true that there are others who suffer as much as, if not in some cases, more than blacks? These questions reveal a basic misunderstanding of black theology and also a superficial view of the world at large. There are at least 3 points to be made here. First, in a revolutionary situation, there can never be nonpartisan theology. Theology is always identified with a particular community. It is either identified with those who inflict oppression or with those who are its victims. A theology of the latter is authentic Christian theology, and a theology of the former is a theology of the Antichrist. And I want to be clear and read that again. Cone is saying theology is always identified with a particular community. It is either identified with those who inflict oppression, or it is identified with the victims. He says a theology that is identified with the victims is an authentic theology. But a theology that is identified with those who inflict oppression is a theology of the Antichrist. Now, for those who might not be Christians, the Antichrist has to do with Satan, has to do with the devil, evil. Insofar as black theology is a theology arising from an identification with the oppressed black community and seeks to interpret the gospel of Jesus Christ in the light of the liberation of that community, it is Christian theology. American white theology is a theology of the Antichrist, insofar as it arises from an identification with the white community, thereby placing God's approval on white oppression of black existence. Secondly, in a racist society, God is never colorblind. To say God is colorblind is analogous to saying that God is blind to justice and injustice, to right and wrong, to good and evil. Certainly, this is not the picture of God revealed in the Old and New Testaments. Yahweh takes sides. On the one hand, Yahweh sides with Israel against the Canaanites in the occupancy of Palestine. On the other hand, Yahweh sides with the poor within the community of Israel against the rich and other political oppressors. In the New Testament, Jesus is not for all, but for the oppressed, the poor, the unwanted of society, and against oppressors. The God of the biblical tradition is not uninvolved or neutral regarding human affairs. God is decidedly involved. God is active in human history, taking sides with the oppressed of the land. If God is not involved in human history, then all theology is useless, and Christianity itself is a mockery, a hollow, and meaningless diversion. The meaning of this message for our contemporary situation is clear. The God of the oppressed takes sides with the black community. God is not colorblind in the black-white struggle, but has made an unqualified identification with blacks. This means that the movement for black liberation is the very work of God, effecting God's will among men. Thirdly, there are, to be sure, many who suffer, and not all of them are black. Many white liberals derive a certain joy from reminding black militants that 2/3 of the poor in America are white. Of course, I could point out that this means that there are 5 times as many poor blacks as there are poor whites, when the ratio of each group to the total population is taken into account. But it's not my intention to debate white liberals on this issue, for it is not the purpose of black theology to minimize the suffering of others, including whites. Black theology merely tries to discern the activity of the Holy One in achieving the purpose of the liberation of humankind from the forces of oppression. We must make decisions about where God is at work so we can join in the fight against evil. But there is no perfect guide for discerning God's movement in the world, contrary to what many conservatives would say. The Bible is not a blueprint on this matter. It is a valuable symbol for pointing to God's revelation in Jesus, but it is not self-interpreting. We are thus placed in an existential situation of freedom in which the burden is on us to make decisions without a guaranteed ethical guide. This is the risk of faith. For the black theologian, God is at work in the black community, vindicating black victims of white oppression. It is impossible for the black theologian to be indifferent on this issue. Either God is for blacks in their fight for liberation from white oppressors, or God is not. God cannot be both for us and for white oppressors at the same time. In this connection, we may observe that black theology takes seriously Paul Tillich's description of the symbolic nature of all theological speech. We cannot describe God directly. We must use symbols that point to dimensions of reality that cannot be spoken of literally. Therefore, to speak of black theology is to speak with the Tertullian understanding of symbol in mind. The focus on blackness does not mean that only blacks suffer as victims in a racist society. Just like saying Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that all lives don't matter, that other lives don't matter. But that blackness is an ontological symbol and a visible reality which best describes what oppression means in America. Now, Jane Elliott used a technique that I think is very important. And those who are watching or listening at this time, particularly white Americans, white Euro-Americans, if you don't think that black represents oppression in America, how many of you would choose to wake up tomorrow as a black person? The extermination of native peoples, he has Amerindians, Indians, the persecution of Jews, the oppression of Mexican Americans, and every other conceivable inhumanity done in the name of God and country. These brutalities can be analyzed in terms of the white American inability to recognize humanity in persons of color. If the oppressed of this land want to challenge the oppressive character of white society, they must begin by affirming their identity in terms of the reality that is anti-white. Blackness, then, stands for all victims of oppression who realize that the survival of their humanity is bound up with liberation from whiteness. This is why, one of the reasons why our last episode we titled Whiteness Must End. This is the writing of James Cone. James Cone challenges us to recognize the reality that we live in. We live still in a white racist society, and we live in a white racist world. White male minority rule is the state of the world today. Whiteness, white supremacy, is against blackness. And blackness represents all people of color. The majority of the people on the earth are people of color. The question is, are we going to allow a minority to rule the majority? Now, it would be one thing if whites demonstrated love and concern for people of color and for the earth. But history has shown us, which is why whites are fighting against it being taught in school, because we've seen the horrors inflicted on indigenous people all over the earth because of whites' inability to see people of color as human beings. Cone reminds us that God is identified with those who are being oppressed. Black people and people of color all over the earth are being oppressed. God is at work in our fight for liberation. Which side, my brothers and sisters, will you be on? God has chosen. The goddess, she has chosen. The Spirit has chosen to side with the oppressed, to join in the liberation of not only people of the earth, but the earth itself. Which side will you be on?
Well, as you can see, we all see the world differently. Thank you for joining us today on Thoughts for Living podcast. Please subscribe and visit us at www.thoughtsforliving.com for more episodes. Thank you again. Please email us with your thoughts if you have any.